Welcome back. I have no idea why I thought Chris Drury was the GM of the Philadelphia Flyers. I knew it was Daniel Briere. If you asked me outside of a video who's the GM of the Flyers, I'd be like, Daniel Briere. What kind of moron would say Chris Drury? Oh, I'll blame that on the entertainment guy. Anyways, I want to talk about Stanley Cup champions today because, of course, we're coming up to about a week and a half from now when we're all going to get our brackets in and we're going to make our predictions. I'll make my predictions too. So does the past give us any kind of indication over what team is most likely to win? And the answer is probably not. And one thing that I noticed in the early 90s was that very often teams that struggled in the first couple of rounds or were finding their footing the first couple of rounds would figure it out and they'd win the Stanley Cup. And I felt like I'd found a formula, and then mid-90s that just went away. That was just gone. And so it is one of those things that we all kind of take pride in. Hey, if we can predict, like last year I predicted almost every series correctly, -1 Rangers. But at any rate, beating Carolina like that. But I mean, some years are kind of predictable and some aren't, right? We have seen 2019 was a really good example of highly unpredictable. And there have been others. Now, that's something else I can investigate at another time. Years we've seen the most upsets. But I want to look at Stanley Cup champions, where they've been and what their record's been like. Because I've talked as well about how teams that are playing well at the end of the season very often will win the Stanley Cup. So let's test that theory. We'll go through teams during the salary cap era. So starting with 05-06, when the cap is introduced. Carolina won the Cup that year. That was a surprise. They were 16-9 in the playoffs. They were 4th overall in the regular season standings, but I don't recall anybody picking them to win the Stanley Cup. February through April, they were 15-11-4. So not a fantastic record, not a bad one, and no team was below 500 in the last few months of the season that ends up winning the Stanley Cup, which isn't really a surprise. Carolina, 4-2 in the first round, 4-1 in the second round, and then it took a full 7 games, both in the conference final and the Stanley Cup final. So a lot of drama there, and that's something else that changed over the years. The Stanley Cup final very often was a complete and total one-sided affair in the 80s. That definitely changed, especially in the salary cap era. Then you have Anaheim in 2007. They were also 4th overall in the league. So have we found a number where you can most likely win the Stanley Cup? Not really. Only one 4th place team has won since 2007. So they were 16-7-6 from February through April, and they had a fantastic run in the playoffs, 16-5. They lost 1 game in the first round, the second round, and the final. They lost 2 games in the conference final against Detroit. So that's as close to a challenge as Anaheim had. They were, and that was, I had picked Anaheim myself that year. So I'll be honest, I did not pick Carolina. I did pick Anaheim that year because they had Pronger, they had Niedermayer. I felt like that was unfair to the rest of the National Hockey League. 2008, Detroit wins it. They also were 1st overall in the NHL, so they were the President's Trophy winners. Down the stretch, February through April, they were 16-11-3. So not as solid a record as Anaheim's 16-7-6. So Anaheim's the one of the 3 so far that we can look at and say was playing really well going into the Stanley Cup playoffs. In those playoffs, Detroit went 16-6. They were they won in 6 games in the first, third, and fourth round, meaning Stanley Cup final. In the second round, they got a sweep. So for Detroit, they got a bit of a rest in between rounds 2 and 3, but they didn't really get that much of a rest in between any of the other rounds. And they did pretty well with it. Then in 2009, Pittsburgh wins the first of 3 cups on this board. They were 8th overall in the NHL that year. They haven't been first and won a Stanley Cup in the salary cap era. 21, I don't think they were first in 91 or 92 either. I know they were first in 92, 93, and they got knocked off. I don't think they were first either of the years they won the Cup in the early 90s. So for Pittsburgh, they're 21-6-4 from February through April. They were 16-8 in the playoffs. So the first round took 6 games. The second round took 7. They got a sweep in the conference final, and then the Stanley Cup final took the full 7 games for them. 2010, we're up to Chicago, their first Stanley Cup. They were 3rd overall in the NHL that year. 15-8-4 was their record from February through April. And that was one that, I felt Chicago was probably due. 2008, 2009, I don't remember being right about either Detroit or Pittsburgh. I don't think those were my picks. I know that I picked Washington a couple of times through here, and eventually I just gave up, and then Washington won. So for Chicago, they were 16-6 in the playoffs that year. They won 4 out of 6 in the first, second, and fourth round. That's all you have to do. All you have to do to win the Stanley Cup is win 4 out of 7 games in any given series. It sounds so easy. They get a sweep as well in that conference final. So the conference final, not quite as tense as what you might want either for Pittsburgh or for Chicago if you're a hockey fan, but for both teams, they get a good rest going into a pretty tough Stanley Cup final. 2011, it's Boston. They were 7th overall in the NHL that year. They were 18-10-4 going into the playoffs from February through April. Nope, I didn't pick them to win that year. 16-9 was the record in the playoffs. They get a sweep in the second round. I believe that was against Philly. And they won in Game 7 against Montreal, Tampa, and Boston. Or against Vancouver. Not that I'm counting or anything. Not that that run is etched into my memory or anything. But yeah, it was an interesting year. Of course, that playoff, there was a lot of upset from Canuck fans, but there was upset from Tampa Bay fans before that. Tampa Bay's power play was lethal. There were no power plays in Game 7. None. It was all even strength. It was a very, very close game, and if Tampa Bay had a couple of power plays, yeah, they probably would have knocked Boston off. At any rate, 2012... the LA Kings end up going 16-4 in that ridiculous run to the Stanley Cup. They were 13th overall in the NHL, and there was no indication of what was to come. The months of February through April, they were 16-11-5. So they were not, absolutely the sexy pick to win. When they knocked off Vancouver in the first round in 5 games, and that was a President's Trophy winner in Vancouver, there was a lot of laughing. That laughing went away. They swept round 2, and then in round 3 they won in 5, and in round 4, Stanley Cup final, they won in 6. So the Stanley Cup final took a little bit longer than the other two, but it looked like they barely broke a sweat on their way to their first Stanley Cup. And it's because all the sweat was from Jonathan Quick, who made sure this was over really, really fast. 2013, of course, this is a lockout-shortened season, so the schedule ended up being a little bit later. So Chicago finished first that year. That is the last time that a President's Trophy winners won the Stanley Cup. They were 37-4 from February through April. And then in the playoffs, they went 16-7. The first round, they won it in 5. The second round, it was in 7. That's where they get challenged. Then 5 games in round 3, and the Stanley Cup final, 6 games against Boston. I remember thinking, they beat Vancouver, they won't beat Boston. Well, Chicago beat Boston. What now? Anyways, 2014, the LA Kings, 16-10 in the playoffs that year. They were 9th overall in the NHL. It was far less of a surprise. And they were considered a dangerous team. It didn't matter where they finished in the standings. They were 16-8-2 from February through April. So they had a better run in 2014 than they did in 2012 going into the playoffs. But they had a much tougher time in the playoffs. It took 7 games for them to knock out their opponents in rounds 1, 2, and 3. And then in the final, they won it in 5. So they avoided the 16-12 record, which is the most amount of games that a Stanley Cup winner could play, 28. But they didn't avoid it by much. Chicago, in 2015, they went 16-7. So for Chicago, 16-6, 16-7, 16-7. That's kind of their sweet spot, I guess. They were 7th overall in the NHL that year, down from 3rd, down from 1st. They were 17-11-4 going into the playoffs from February through April. That record being worse than both 2010 and 2013. In the playoffs, they won in 6 in the first round. They swept the second round. Third round, they won it in 7, and then in the Stanley Cup final, they won it in 6. So a little bit more difficult path, it seems, in those final 2 rounds than normal, but they still win it, and they get that sweep in the second round. Then you have Pittsburgh, 2016. They were 4th overall that year. They were 24-9-1 from February through April. Really good run for them going into the playoffs. They were 16-8 in those playoffs. They won in the first round 4-1. Second round 4-2. Third round took 7 games. So the conference final really tough, and then in the final against San Jose, they won it in 6. That was, of course, the first Stanley Cup final with this channel up and running as a hockey channel, even though it was just in its infancy. But I remember doing a video congratulating the Penguins on a Stanley Cup win. 2017, they won it again. They're hogging the cup. They were 16-9 in those playoffs. They were actually 2nd overall in the standings that year. 19-8-6 was the record from February through April that year. So again, another really solid run for them going into the playoffs. And then in the playoffs, they win in 5 games in round 1. It takes 7 games in both the second round and the conference final. And then in the Stanley Cup final, it took 6. So outside of the first round, there wasn't one you could really look at and say was easy, but they do win every round, of course, to win the Cup. And in 2018, it looked like they might do it again, but Washington stopped them. Now, Washington was 7th overall. The interesting thing being they had been defending President's Trophy winners, back-to-back President's Trophy winners as well. And their worst regular season in years, they were 19-11-2 from February through April. I didn't give them a chance, and they won. They went 16-8 in the playoffs. They won in 6 games in the first and second round, the second round being that victory over Pittsburgh. And then it took 7 games in the conference final against Tampa. That was a ridiculously good conference final. And then in the finals, they beat Vegas 4-1. 2019, it is St. Louis. Famously St. Louis, right? They were 12th overall in the standings. They ended up going 16-10 in the playoffs. But their run to get to the playoffs from February through April, 23-6-4. So absolutely a great run for them going into the playoffs. In those playoffs, they won it in 6 games in the first round and in the conference final. In the second round and the Stanley Cup final, it took until 7 games. So they and LA are the ones that have taken the most games to win that Stanley Cup. Of course, LA being 9th, St. Louis being 12th. It's not really a surprise that they didn't dominate teams, but they won the games they had to, and they won that cup. 2020, it's Tampa coming off of a nuclear meltdown in 2019 in the playoffs. They come back and they figured it out. Now, of course, 2020 is kind of a mess. They end up being 3rd. There's an asterisk all over this year because you have the pause. The NHL shuts down. I remember just thinking, is NHL coming back? And it did. Now, from January through March, when we had the pause, the Tampa Bay Lightning 22-8-2. So they were playing really well going into the pause. And then the run to the playoff, or run to the Stanley Cup, ends up officially being 18-7-2, although they were 16-6 once you get to rounds 1 through 4. They had the tournament before that, the little round robin that you had overtime losses, so it just made a mess out of everything. But for Tampa Bay, they won in 5 games in round 1 and round 2, and then it took 6 games in the conference final as well as the Stanley Cup final. So honestly, Tampa Bay, really good run there. And I understand there's people who don't like that Stanley Cup and want to put an asterisk next to it for other reasons. I don't agree. 2021, it is Tampa Bay again. They win 16 games to 7, so they won 16. They lost 7 there. They were 8th overall in the NHL that year. So it doesn't really matter where they're sitting in the standings. Right now, they're currently 12th, for instance. But in the playoffs, they can turn it on. Now, from March through May, because, again, we had the weird season that it was of 2021 where it's just playing in your division, they were 22-13-2. So that's the final 3 months of the season. In the playoffs, they win it in 6 in the first round. Second round took 5 games. 7 games in the third round. And then in the Stanley Cup final, they won it in 5 over the Montreal Canadiens. The previous year, of course, defeating the Dallas Stars. Then we get to last season, Colorado, and we're back to a normal regular season, although the regular season does go later because of a break in between and all this. Just the schedule was kind of a mess. But from February through April, the Colorado Avalanche go 24-11-4. They were 2nd overall last season. They really were a favorite. I picked them that year. 16-4 is their overall record in the playoffs. That equals the LA Kings for the fastest run to the Stanley Cup. 16-5 by the Ducks being the next closest. It was a sweep in round 1. It was a sweep in the conference final. It took 6 games for them to get out of round 2, and it took 6 games for them to win the Stanley Cup last year. So if we look at the standings and the question of who's going to end up winning, you can get into who's playing well right now. And, I mean, there are numerous teams that are playing, like Edmonton right now is lights out. So if your belief is the team that's playing well going to the playoffs has a good chance, the Oilers are more than just a dark horse. They could be one of the top 3-4 favorites, right? I would also say that for right now, Vegas has been playing well. Like, really, the Pacific Division's got 3 teams. The LA Kings, before the 2 games against the Oilers, definitely look like they might be a favorite to win the division as well. But if we look at the overall standings, currently number 1 is Boston. There have been 2 teams that have been first overall that have won the Cup in this era. The number 2 team, and we have two different teams that have been 2nd overall that have won it. Well, right now it's Carolina. That's number 2. New Jersey's number 3. There are 2 two teams that have been third that have won the Stanley Cup. So New Jersey. So there's no magical spot in the standings either. I've looked this up over many years, and there really isn't one. But yeah, New Jersey, they've got two Stanley Cup champions in this era, but they don't have a Stanley Cup of their own since 2003. So the third spot has been the home of two Stanley Cup champions. The Devils looking to win their first Stanley Cup of the salary cap era. Fourth overall is the Vegas Golden Knights. Now, fourth overall, we've got three teams that have been fourth that have won the Stanley Cup. So, but that's 2006, 2007, and 2016. So, right from there, right? But for Vegas, this is going to be a really interesting playoff, because if they don't get out of the first round, what do you do? Then in fifth and sixth were Toronto and the New York Rangers. The problem is no team that's been fifth or sixth has won the Stanley Cup in this era, so they're not on the board. At seventh is the Oilers. Seventh place, there's two. There's two that have been seventh that have won it. Three. Actually, there's three. There you go, Oiler fans. There's three. Just stay seventh. The LA Kings being eighth. There's been two that have been eighth in the league that have won the Stanley Cup. Colorado's ninth. There's been one team that's been ninth that's won the Stanley Cup. Then you get down to 12th, where Tampa Bay resides. That's where St. Louis won the Cup from. And 13th overall is currently Seattle, and that's where LA won from. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. A lot of different spots right there, and it's 9 different spots where you've won a Stanley Cup from. And I wouldn't rule out 5th or 6th. The reality is that we talk a lot about the President's Trophy curse, but this is a league where no matter where you finished during the regular season, you have a chance of winning the Stanley Cup. It definitely helps being one of the top 8 teams, but as you can see, teams that have been 9th, 12th, 13th have won it as well. If you get hot at the right time, which the Kings did twice, St. Louis did as well, you can win it. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. And yeah, the most interesting videos I've done have usually been on which Stanley Cup champions I thought were most dominant, and then that can get kind of ugly too. But at any rate, there you go. Thank you guys so much for all your support, and I will talk to you again soon.